Hi everyone, and welcome back if you've been here before. Today I'd like to do a review about a book tackling a very important and practical topic, which is what to do if you find a body in your library, a dead body. So I read another Agatha Christie mystery, and I decided to try out this time a Miss Marple novel, my second for Miss Marple. And don't worry if you're more of a Poirot person, I do plan to keep moving along on Poirot novels too. Actually, I've read After the Funeral, and I'm working on a review of that one. But for some reason, I was just looking for something different with a bit of a different personality this time, so I decided to check out The Body in the Library. Over a year ago, I read the first Marple mystery, Murder at the Vicarage, and I reviewed that one on my channel too. I very much enjoyed that mystery and found it a refreshing change of pace from Hercule Poirot. Don't get me wrong, Poirot is amazing, but sometimes I need a little break from the order and method of Poirot's investigation, and Murder at the Vicarage satisfied that pretty well. That's not to say that Marple's first mystery was dull by comparison, though. Not only was that novel substantially longer than the average Poirot mystery, it also was immensely complicated and involved keeping straight a huge amount of local gossip, so much that I eventually just hit overload and was really unable to make any further inferences, and instead just had to see how things played out, a fact which I mentioned in my review of that book. And in some sense, we get a similar, but in my opinion, even more satisfying execution of that style here in Marple's second novel-length adventure, The Body at the Library. The Body in the Library. The body wasn't seen at the library, it was presumably placed in the library. This is all the more impressive since the novel clocked in at just over 5 hours on the audiobook version I listened to, making it slightly shorter than the average Poirot novel. But like Murder at the Vicarage, this novel introduces the reader to a progressively growing cast of characters and connections to the point where after a while we'll again be priding ourselves not just on solving the mystery, but even on just being able to recall specific details at the moments when they're most relevant. And also, as in Murder at the Vicarage, I really enjoyed this aspect, especially since I was more prepared for it this time. I'd say that by 2/3 of the way into the novel, I still didn't really have a great idea of what was going on, but in this Marple mystery, that doesn't really feel quite so bothersome. Bothersome isn't really the right word here, but when Poirot is tauntingly presenting the facts to us and challenging us to use our order and method, and in a novel where the puzzle is really the center of everything, you can really feel when you're failing to make the connection, or in some cases when you're thinking you made the connection and then you're totally wrong, although that's usually a little bit more fun. Miss Marple is at least a little bit more gentle, though. Even though she implies certain deductions to be rather obvious, she doesn't seem to expect others to follow along, and the general feel of the book is one that I think can be more easily enjoyed even if you're just not this type to get out a bulletin board and actually start tracking down clues and suspects. Like, you could enjoy this novel even if you're just in it for the story and not really trying to solve it, but just see what happens. Now, I won't be getting into spoilers right away as I talk about this novel, but I will eventually, so as usual, I'll tell you when that's about to happen. The central conceit of this novel is one and the same as that used in Dorothy Sayers' Whose Body, which is also a great book, by the way. An unidentified body shows up in a seemingly random location, in this case a house 30 miles away from London, and the inhabitants of the house, or at least one of the inhabitants, and maybe both of them, seem genuinely baffled, having never seen the murdered woman in their lives. Thus, the immediate mystery becomes one of whose body this is. Now, for a bit of historical context, Whose Body was published in 1923 and The Body in the Library not until 1942, meaning that by the time of publication of Agatha Christie's novel, she and many of her readers would have naturally been familiar with this popular and influential work by Sayers. I'm sure there are actually other instances of this conceit in detective fiction too, as it sounds like it was already a pretty common trope in detective fiction at the time, and Christie didn't pretend to be the first to do this, she just wanted to take her own stab at it. But Whose Body is the instance that I'm most familiar with, and Agatha Christie herself would have certainly read that one. In fact, in a fun little surprise halfway through this book, The Body in the Library, we're introduced to a young boy who's read all the great detective novels, and he names Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie as the first two authors in his list. Anyway, the opening question of this mystery is, again, whose body is this? And also, why is it here in this bizarre location? And though the body is pretty quickly identified within about an hour or so, the circumstances and the level of corroboration we receive are sketchy enough that any fans of the genre will remain skeptical for some time to come. Something I'll reflect on a bit more in the spoilery section, but I don't think it's a spoiler to say that you're being a little too trustworthy if you don't at least question a little bit whose body this is. Though Miss Marple is known for solving more of the cozy type mysteries, from what I understand, normally confined to a country village, St. Mary Mead, I think it's called. Here, a lot of the investigation takes place actually in the city at a sort of dance club, as I understand it, where some of the prime suspects are actually staying. I think it's affiliated with a hotel of sorts. In these sections especially, the novel sometimes brings in a bit of a darker tone, while still never really coming close to your sort of hard-boiled detective subgenre. It also becomes clear pretty soon that we're dealing with a pretty devious criminal who's not afraid to abduct and murder fairly young girls, and we'll see later in the novel that the body in the library is only the first episode of the story. The overall pacing of the novel was, for me, excellent. Christie starts us asking questions from the very first page, possibly even the first paragraph, and they don't stop until the very end. The mystery was clever and concise and a cut above even the already decent predecessor, Murder at the Vicarage, and frankly a cut above most of the Christie stories I've read. Yes, some of the characters who turn out not to be wrapped up in the murder after all might bore you a bit, but I guess that's just the thing, isn't it? You never really know which of them could be involved, and in this novel, Christie avoids the mistake that she sometimes makes of leaving a lot of suspicion on characters who neither feel central enough to be satisfying should they turn out to be the murderer, nor peripheral enough that you feel safe turning your attention away from them, which always makes them feel a little bit boring or frustrating, but that doesn't happen here. We have a pretty good sense here of who the suspects are, and although some definitely will be under more suspicion from both the detectives and the reader by the end, they all feel like fair game, or at least couldn't be ruled out as potential accomplice, and it really seems like any of these people would have been a satisfying culprit, provided there was good and convincing explanation behind it. And I'm happy to say that in this one, I think there really is. I saw parts of it coming, I didn't piece together the whole thing, and there are a few slightly questionable aspects of the solution. I'll touch a bit more on those in the spoiler section, but for me, this is probably in the top 25% of Christie's mystery plots in terms of tightness and an overall satisfying solution. I don't have too much to say about Miss Marple herself. She doesn't feel as central as Poirot can be, and although the idea of a meek, middle-aged village woman as a counterbalance to her pompous and obsessive counterpart, Hercule Poirot, seems kind of appealing, thus far Marple hasn't really reached a depth of development that makes me really interested in her. She feels more like a curiosity than anything, but that said, I didn't fully appreciate many of the dimensions of Hercule Poirot until I was several books in that series, so I'll still give Miss Marple a chance to grow on me. If it's not obvious by now, I'd recommend this novel for anyone who likes the genre, even if you're not a die-hard Christie fan. Let's get into the spoilers now, though. So whose body is this and why is it here? We're repeatedly told, and it's repeatedly confirmed, that this is the body of Ruby Keene, but there are a number of circumstances that may leave us doubting. Ruby Keene was not said by others to be particularly attractive, though the dead woman found in the library was supposedly noted to be at least somewhat attractive, or so I thought. And maybe the actual clues were a little bit different, though, but there were some discrepancies in the supposed appearances of the two girls. Basil Blake also has a new girlfriend hanging out around the village, and we might certainly wonder whether she actually is Ruby Keene, or even the other missing girl mentioned earlier in the story who later supposedly turns up in a torched car, in circumstances a bit too suspicious to be taken with full credulity. And why did Ruby Keene change into a less elegant outfit before going out on a date? Well, maybe she didn't. Maybe this isn't actually her body. And in fact, there's only one person in the novel who actually both knows Ruby Keene and has ID'd this body as hers. More on that shortly, though. The harder question for me was why, if this is not really Ruby Keene's body, would it be presented as if it were hers, and whose body actually is it then? Well, as details emerge throughout the book, one possible explanation is the following. Ruby Keene wanted to disappear. Perhaps it was an attachment she had with Basil Blake, like she could have actually been this woman who was seen with Basil Blake at the start of the novel, but it's hard to tell exactly. Another young schoolgirl was kidnapped, a girl guide. That girl was named Pamela, I think. She was killed and her body was dressed up to look similar enough to Ruby Keene's to be convincing to most others. And this inference was actually correct, by the way, although I couldn't have ever been sure of it. The body was then ID'd by cousin Josie, another point of uncertainty for me because I couldn't really tell whether Josie had actually, and quite possibly inaccurately, believed and ID'd the body to be Ruby's, which seemed kind of unlikely, or if she had intentionally come forward and misidentified the body of a girl that nobody else actually knew. And then maybe this later car murder was staged to look like the murder of the vanished girl guide, Pamela, so that the absence of her body would be explained, though in fact it was just a random and already dead body placed in the car, maybe taken from the morgue, but with a bunch of obvious clues placed in the car to make the thick-headed police satisfied beyond a doubt that it must be the missing girl guide. So I actually thought that there might be two disappearances, but actually only one of the two had really died, which was not correct. So yeah, I thought this was a pretty decent explanation, though it still left a lot of things unexplained. Like, why would Ruby Keene run away right at the time when she was set to receive a lot of money through adoption by the wealthy Conway Jefferson, even if she was romantically attached to Basil Blake? Was there a chance that Conway Jefferson himself had in fact orchestrated the killing, enraged maybe to find out something about her that bothered him and left him feeling betrayed? Seems like a little bit of a questionable motive there, though, especially if he really was fond of her. Most importantly, though, my question, and a question that was on the right track, was what does Josie have to do with all of this? What are her motivations here? Is she in on this scheming if we do believe that the body is not actually Ruby's? What's in it for her, since it seems she might benefit more if Ruby stood to inherit the 50,000 pounds from Conway Jefferson? Although that suggestion, though implied by some things Josie said, should probably be questioned, since I don't necessarily think it's true that Josie would have benefited from her cousin inheriting 50,000 pounds. Of course, there are other possibilities. Maybe this body really is Ruby's. That seemed pretty unlikely to me, though, because if, say, Ruby was the actual victim, all these side clues like the body in the torched car seem pretty meaningless and counterproductive, just getting the killer into more trouble than he or she was already in. But maybe most importantly of all, a central question that's similar but slightly different from the one presented in Dorothy Sayers Who's Body, and a difference alluded to by the different titles of the two books, is why was the body dropped off in the library? In whose body? We mostly assume that the body was placed in this flat so that it would be discovered, since the flat was as convenient a location as any, presumably close to the spot where the murder took place. However, in the body in the library, the place where the body is dropped seems a singularly inconvenient location. So this must really be the crux of the mystery here. For whom is it especially convenient to drop a body in the library? Or maybe more accurately, for whom would it be especially inconvenient, indicating a possibility that this person was intentionally framed? My answer to this question, though, about 3/4 of the way through the book, was that one reason for the body's placement was specifically to prevent anyone who actually knew Ruby Keene from seeing the body, since then it might be discovered that it was not actually her body. And no one else but her cousin knew her well enough that they would actually come out to see the body themselves. If the body had simply been dropped in London, this wouldn't do, since they'd know right away it wasn't Ruby. There's a little bit of a loophole in that explanation, because it's not inconceivable that one of the other people at the hotel would eventually see the body, maybe at a funeral, and discover that it was entirely faked. But could there be another reason? There's a fact of convenience. If Basil Blake had really been involved in the whole affair, it would have been convenient for him to drop the body nearby. Or maybe it was for reasons of inconvenience. If Colonel Bantry, who had the body show up in his library, he obviously found it disadvantageous to have this body turn up in his library, and maybe he had some concealed connections with this dead girl or those around her. Seems a little unlikely, but these ideas were still brewing, but this was about as much as I could figure out before the final revelation. And these questions, as you'll now know if you've read the book, were the right questions to be asking, but some of them also turned out to be misleading, since the killers didn't actually drop the body at Colonel Bantry's house. They dropped it at Basil Blake's to frame him, and then he kind of tampered with the crime scene. So in the end, it turns out to be Josie and Mark Gaskell, with Josie's motive for involvement being that she's married to Mark, and thus will also stand to inherit as long as Ruby's not in the way. I was quite satisfied with the solution, especially with the fact that Josie was the culprit, or a culprit. This all seemed well laid out and explained, and the motives were clear enough that once Miss Marple started hinting at the possibility of unknown marriages in the reveal scene, I rapidly pieced it all together from there. Well, mostly. The explanation of the crime setup and execution may have stretched the imagination just a little. I think some readers find that to be true. The part about the body being moved to a different location than where it was originally planted, fine, that's absolutely fine, even though I thought it a little goofy. The abduction and killing of a second girl to make her look like the first, all for the sake of establishing an alibi, and then killing the actual Ruby within a different time frame, it's a little bit out there. Not totally out there, but certainly incredibly devious. And I think most readers will have a hard time adding up the actual times of night to see just how it all works out that this would establish an alibi, let alone to then figure out that this was indeed what happened. So while I mostly buy the execution of it, how it was staged and how it was planned, the exact timing of things pushes it almost to the point of ridiculousness, but just almost, because I still found it pretty satisfying, all things considered. I'd be curious if anyone actually figured out the alibi establishing motive, although obviously it would have been possible to identify at least many of the sort of hints leading to this ultimate conclusion. So yeah, The Body in the Library was a pleasure to read, and I suggest it to anyone who likes mysteries enough to watch videos of people talking about them at length. Highly recommended. And I hope you've all been reading some good mysteries yourself, or just anything good at all, and I'll see you again soon.